Blessings in Jesus' name. So today I was successfully communicating the message about the criminal and treasonous and seditious activity that's going on in our government right now to a group of people. Firstly, at the Bullring, I spent about 15 minutes just communicating the idea, because I don't like to labour the idea where there's like a captive audience, like where the same people are there. Like, it's different if it's like, for example, a business, because they've no expectation of silence. I mean, they have a business in the centre of town, so they've no expectation of silence, or they're at work. They should be busy anyway. So, like, when people are sort of located in one area, you don't need to keep repeating yourself because they've heard it the first time round, or maybe you repeat it once, but not keep on doing it, because we learn by repetition anyway, and you mightn't hear it all the first time, and that's why sometimes I'll repeat things or rephrase things, because one person might know what one word means and not the other. So I'll try to use as many terms as I can that will be accessible to all levels of all ages. So or sometimes I'll use specific terminology if I don't want the children to know what I'm saying about a certain topic. So you just have to be cognizant of who's in the environment as well. But the point I'm making is that I spent about 15 minutes in the Bullring and I was communicating the idea. And basically what it boils down to is the Court of Ireland, the Court of Appeal actually, are commanding Irish people that they should presume certain legislation's constitutional, even though there wasn't a test on constitutionality run prior to their signing it into as law. So obviously if the President isn't doing his job maintaining and upholding and enforcing the Constitution and the law, then he's not acting as custodian of the Constitution, which we pay him to be, and which his out of office states. So he's not doing his job, but is actually doing the opposite. Because what the courts are now telling us is to do is presume certain legislation's constitutional. And we don't have to do that. Nobody can command your ignorance. And what is presumption but a form of ignorance? I mean, ignorance just means a lack of knowledge. People have sort of been conditioned to think that, ignorance is an insult to somebody. If you were to claim that somebody was ignorant of something, that would be an insult unto them. And that's not necessarily the case, because we're all ignorant of something, right? I don't know very much about agriculture or botany, but the art of folding paper into shapes, origami. I don't have knowledge on that, but so you could call me ignorant on that subject to a large extent. I wouldn't take that as an insult, it's just a fact. So, but ignorance in law is no excuse. Like, you can't get off committing a crime by ignorance of the law preventing it. And we call that in law as a precept. Ignorance is no excuse. So if ignorance is no excuse in law, the court can't command your ignorance on a topic by telling you to presume on the constitutionality of it. Because what is presumption but a form of ignorance? To assume, to presume. And to assume means literally in the lack of evidence. So a lack of evidence is a lack of knowledge. A lack of knowledge is ignorance. So when it's your responsibility to know something and you have access to know it, and the one telling you to be ignorant of it is the one that's duty bound to communicate or ascertain the constitutionality of the legislation they're asking you to be ignorant of, that body commit a crime. Firstly, they don't fulfil the office of President, or another term would be custodian of the Constitution. And secondly, they don't fulfil their duty to you to uphold the Constitution and the law in the courts of law. And they're sort of claiming the absence of the Constitution when they tell you to presume on the constitutionality of legislation. Why? Because we don't lack the evidence. What's the evidence then? Where is it? It's the Constitution. So in every court in the land in Ireland, the warrant of that court, which is the jurisdiction or the authority of the court to judge you, extended to them by the Constitution, must have the Constitution present and knowledge of the Constitution. So we must have learned men studied in constitutional law as our judges, our president, our politicians, our police officers. So we must have those men in positions of knowing on those subjects. So then they can't command your ignorance, knowing that a precept of law is ignorance is no excuse. So if I can't be ignorant of my law, I can't obey laws I don't know, well then they can't tell you to presume on the constitutionality of legislation, because it's their job to ascertain constitutionality prior to signing it in to the law. So presumption on constitutionality is not something that the Court of Appeal can command. Now, as I said, I was up in the Bullring, and then I moved on to Redmond Square, and I was just cycling down the thoroughfare, and I'm always very careful and very, very slow going down the thoroughfare. And actually, there's no law against cycling on the path in Ireland. You just have to be cognizant and have reasonable consideration for other people. Now, of course, not everybody does, but it doesn't mean that people can come along bureaucratically, or guards can come along and start telling you can't go on the path. They just can't, because there's no law against it in Ireland. And it's not reasonable that there would be. I mean, when you consider that the police are cycling up and down on their police bicycles, the postman's going up and down in his little tricycle with the box on the back, which is electrically driven. He's not ever going very fast either, in fairness to him. You have even wheelchairs which can go fairly fast going up and down for the disabled. You have prams and buggies. You've all manner of vehicles on that thoroughfare. Even vans at certain times of the day. Post vans or delivery vans, DPD and all the couriers. And so the only vehicle you don't want is a bicycle. It just doesn't make sense. So the only actual governing rule is reasonable consideration. It's like, you don't be silly, and if you see an old lady, speed up alongside her or something, and you have a little bell and you give them a little bit of notification from a way back that you're about to pass, or and things of that nature. And you reasonably consider other people. When you're turning a corner, you're slow down. When you're, so it's just not reasonable to believe that in Ireland there's a law saying that bicycles can only go on the road. It's just not the case. The only thing is reasonable consideration. Scooters and all sorts of motorised vehicles require sometimes local access. They require access to certain areas that they can't get to by road, at least without climbing 2 or 3 hills and going all the way around town to get there. So sometimes it's just ridiculous to ask the bike to just remain on the road. And the only thing really in Ireland is reasonable consideration. So anyway, I was at the Redmond Square, and Redmond Square is quite a big square, and it was empty when I got there. And I just started cycling in a circle in the square on my bike while I was giving this advice to people, and about the presumption of constitutionality being something we don't have to actually engage, because we never lack access to the Constitution to ascertain as to whether a legislation is constitutional or not. And so presumption in law is not available to anybody. The only time the word presumption is used is in the absence of the evidence. For example, presumption of innocence, or innocent until proven guilty is another way of phrasing it. But the presumption of innocence only remains until the evidence has been produced. So presumption literally means, in effect, in the lack of the evidence. And if you don't lack evidence of the Constitution, and it must be present to establish the warrant of the court and jurisdiction, then no court in the land can make a presumption on constitutionality. And they surely should not be commanding people to do so, to presume on constitutionality. But the courts, the High Court and the Court of Appeal in Ireland, have told us that we must presume sections of the Criminal Justice Act 2006 presumptively constitutional, even though the High Court was tasked with testing it, even though the Court of Appeal that made that statement, or that concluded that we must consider it presumptively constitutional, were judicially reviewing the previous High Court conclusion that stated it remains an open question as to whether sections 115 and 117 are actually lawful or not, or constitutional or not. And so if the High Court said, we don't know, remains an open question, then how can the Court of Appeal command us in that ignorance to obey those sections of the Criminal Justice Act without having done the test? So they were judicially reviewing the conclusion of the High Court and never judicially reviewed the testing of the constitutionality of Section 115 and 117 of the Criminal Justice Act 2006. And like the High Court, they didn't give a reason either for not carrying out the test. While both of them were tasked with so doing, they elected instead to use something written into legislation which is unlawful in and of itself, presumptively constitutional. Now, nothing is presumptively constitutional because, again, we don't lack the evidence of the Constitution. It's present in every court of the land. It's present in every lavatory in the land. It is everywhere there is a person who's Irish, and it precedes them anywhere they go in Ireland. It is the Constitution of the land, and so you cannot presume on what is available to check. You can download it on your phone at any stage in any place. You just don't lack the evidence that they're claiming you lack. They're lying to you. I downloaded it the other day on my phone in a matter of seconds on fibre broadband, literally a matter of seconds. There are 260 pages, 130 of those are the Irish translation. So it's actually a 130-page document. The document's a little bit bigger than the average iPhone, and there's only 130 pages. So, in English. And so it's not an extensive read, it's not very difficult, and it doesn't take long to download. And even if you don't want to download or you don't have space to, you can still read it online. So there's absolutely no excuse. You can buy the physical copy in a bookstore that stocks it. I don't know where they are, but ask. And or you can, as far as I know, you can download it, purchase it online as well for ebook format. But I haven't been able to find that on Android. But you can get it for free as well if you go to the right website. Just, download Irish Constitution, put that into your search bar and you'll find it. So there's little excuse. And if you check the Article 25 of the Constitution, you'll see, I think that's where the oath of office of the President is. But just Google oath of office of President of Ireland and you'll find it also. And he must maintain and enforce the Constitution and the law. That's his job as custodian of the Constitution, as President of Ireland. And so if he was doing his job as custodian of the Constitution, the Court of Appeal could not be commanding you to presume something constitutional, could he? So there's a discrepancy and there's a failure on the part of the President and the courts, which aren't excused because the President didn't bother to do it. They can't be excused in their negligence and misconduct simply because there's legislation in place. They have to test the legislation if there's any ambiguity or if that legislation offends anything they know or is written in the Constitution. And this is where we get the word unconstitutional. And legislation really, ideally, should never be signed into law that's unconstitutional. And that's why we have the President signing bills, because he studied in constitutional law. So now they're claiming he doesn't have to carry out the testing of the constitutionality of the bills prior to their enactment into the legislature or as law, to be considered even law. So they're way out of line. They're committing treason, committing sedition. So absolutely no acceptable excuse. And the fact that the President is now claiming that he's not by way of legislature, and you can check this yourself if you Google is the President accountable to the courts in Ireland, it will tell you he's not accountable if found in misconduct to the courts of Ireland. So my question is, whose President is he then? Because every official that has high responsibility has high incumbency of accountability by way of their responsibility. It doesn't lessen their accountability because they've more responsibility. That doesn't make sense. In days gone by, even the most powerful kings of the earth, once they wrote something, would have to be held accountable to it. Like, it was very, very serious. The king would would fall under his own words and have to make sure, like if he wrote, this person is to be put to death, and he wrote that down and signed it, there would be no way out of that. That person would have to be put to death. So the king would fall under his own word, and his gallery, his council, would hold him accountable to his own words. Well, who's being held accountable? In the president's seat, to the courts of Ireland. Who's holding him accountable? So he has less incumbency or less responsibility than even the greatest of kings in history? Hardly. Michael D. Higgins has to be accountable to the law and to his oath of office. The fact that they're suggesting he's not accountable is exalting him to some kind of tyrannical, dictatorial, occupying power that doesn't submit to the laws he's supposed to enforce. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't ring true. It's not logical. If he's custodian of the Constitution, he absolutely has to submit to the Constitution, because you can't wield the power you yourself don't submit to. Even Jesus Christ, when he came into the Garden of Gethsemane, said, your will be done, Father. Not my will, but your will be done. So he was submitting to the will of the Father, because you cannot wield a power and an authority that you yourself don't submit to. If Jesus submitted, who is President Michael D. Higgins that he doesn't have to submit to the law and to the courts? How can you place somebody in that position of high responsibility in the way of defence of the Irish nation and not hold him accountable? If a criminal got into that position, he could do whatever he wanted, compromising the integrity of the Constitution and the law, compromising national security, and nobody could hold him accountable. Sure, that's preposterous. There's no security in that. So we have to hold these men accountable in their office, to their oath of office, to the Constitution that the Irish people wrote, and they work for us. They are official granted. They have power granted by the Irish people. And so now they're telling us not to be certain that what they're telling us to obey is what we told them to implement and uphold and enforce. That's a big disconnect, guys. That is a compromise of our national security, and it's not an excusable one. Anyway, I was saying these things to the younger generation. It was maybe 5, 6, 7 young girls, young ladies, like they were young adults. I'd say they were even adults, like 18, 17, 18, 19, that kind of region. And they were nodding along and engaging, and I was circling on my bicycle. It was helping me to concentrate on what I was saying. And people were passing through, and I was avoiding them and cycling really slowly, and there was no problem. And next minute a man comes through who's clearly disabled, and I veered to get out of his way, no problem, and he accelerated with his push trolley and banged into the bike. And I don't mean he just tapped it, he purposely rammed me on the bike. I don't know how disabled he can be, because he had a fair amount of strength to ram me off the bike now, because it totally stopped the bike and pushed it over. So anyway, I said, you can't do that, because it was totally obvious to everybody in the area that he purposely pursued me to ram me, and then started shouting at me and chastising me. And I said, you can't do that to people. You can't just assault people like that. And he lifted up his fist to punch me. I said, no, you can't behave like that. I came down here to get a bit of peace. You came down to get a bit of peace by ramming people off bicycles. So I chastised him, as he should have been chastised. That's no acceptable way to treat people. And he went over anyway, and he said, I'm trying to relax, will you shut up and all this. And I thought, this is demonic. This has to be because of what I'm exposing here before these impressionable young people, trying to improve their understanding and tell them about the corruption that's now in their nation. Because they were in agreement with the points I was making on the unreasonable nature of the command of the Court of Appeal. I was explaining to them anything they didn't know so that they'd be able to follow the points I was making. I was respecting them. I didn't assume they knew something or didn't know it. I would ask and then I would explain. And this man came out of nowhere and just he pursued me now quickly and rammed me off the bike. Now I have a sore left hip. He had no consideration for my physical well-being. He didn't know whether I had injuries or infirmities or sickness. Just rammed into me on the bike. Total disregard for my physical safety at all. Just overt violence. And then went and sat down on the thing. And I'm trying to relax. And I said, shh then, relax. And I just continued to circle in the area and engage the young ladies, and eventually they left. I think one was actually crying after she saw the way the man treated me. It's just unacceptable for men to behave like that towards other men in society. It's just barbaric. And it's always the Christian preacher who gets the brunt of it, because we're exposing the corruption. And if people are under any degree of spiritual bondage, they will react violently against the preacher, especially if he's in the zone. If he's light and, the devil can't grab him by the tail and annoy him and vex him and agitate him, then they lash out. And I've had it historically. They do that. They just lash out because they just want to discombobulate you. And that's exactly what I think happened. I think the man was actually possessed at the time. Because it just came out of nowhere. It was totally irrational, like. No warning, no, do you mind not doing that? Or nothing like that. Just straight in with the support, the disability support, the walker, I think they call them, with wheels. You know them ones? Like little trolleys that turn into seats, I think. And rammed me hard with it now. I don't need to mention names. And he said, you're always doing that. And I was like, I never spoke to you before. I don't think I've ever seen you before. So, like that, I stayed for a little while longer, framed my point, and then left. But the people in the Redmond Square had no issue whatsoever with what I was doing. They were actually engaging me, and that's what I think the spirits didn't like. They don't like that you're penetrating the dark boundaries that they're putting up to try and keep people in ignorance. So they'll actually lash out physically. I've been tackled, rammed, kicked, had my 2 rotator cuffs injured by the guards. The list goes on, and just abused verbally, physically. And it always seems to be when you're starting to penetrate and break through the devil's sort of barriers, he lashes out, because he's like a cornered dog. He'll just lash and bite and do anything to try to discombobulate you and become a distraction and chaos in the environment, just to annoy you and reduce the light that's clearly flowing through you. But anyway, by the time he got there, the point was adequately made. There was a group of older ladies and a group of younger ladies over there, and people were lying down on their blankets and smiling over, and they had no issue. And just this man came with his trolley and rammed me all of a sudden. I know he couldn't have been going very fast, but I wasn't paying him any mind. And then, at a distance, because the way it works is there's a square, and then there are 2 long paths leading up to it. So obviously I was circling, paying attention to the ladies and the young ladies that I was engaging with in the conversation. Just whenever it suited them, they chimed in and we would talk. I wasn't addressing them directly or anything. It was just the way it happened. And he beelined for me now. beeline for me and rammed me hard. He wasn't a light man, you know, he had a lot of mass to him. And I wouldn't say he was weak in every part of his body, but he was an older guy. Might have had a hip issue or a back issue or something. And but he had a lot of upper body strength and mass behind him to ram me off the thing. But people pick the most unusual places to come and have a little bit of peace. I mean, a Redmond Square has buses and taxis and all sorts of things, traffic circling in it all day long. Why would you go there for peace? Yeah, you might say the man can't travel too far from his house, you know, but a man speaking there for a few minutes on his microphone shouldn't bother somebody who has peace. It's preposterous that somebody speaking publicly would ruin the peace of somebody. Does it make sense? So it's obviously something on a different spiritual level, just trying to cause a distraction and a discombobulation of what's actually happening there at that time. So when they're escalating to the point of violence, you know that they're panicking, the spirits, because you just know that they're not comfortable when they're escalating it to physical violence. Because of an injury to my deltoid at the moment, suddenly stopping the bike obviously puts in more pressure on that, and my shoulders, which are chronically injured, and then I had to get off the bike suddenly because it tipped over and land fast on my left hip, which is injured. Just no consideration for my physical safety. You know, a disabled man. And they do that. Wicked spirits enter into the people who are most defensible. Like, that's why they send children to rob things, because they're juveniles, they won't go to prison. That's why they send old men, like a stroke victim, one day beeline for me, and now this guy with his push trolley beeline for me. Because wicked spirits will use those guys because they're the most defensible. You know what I'm saying? It's like, oh yeah, now you're picking on guys who just had a stroke. Oh yeah, now you're picking on guys with a trolley. No, they're picking on me. One of them whacked me with a stick, the stroke victim guy, who I had a conversation with another day perfectly peaceably. Then the next time I see him, he's whacking me with a stick. Like, it just doesn't add up. And then this other guy is just, I never met him before, he's ramming me with his trolley, saying, you're always doing that. See, what they try to do is make you look bad in the eyes of the people. That's all. So that people won't resonate with you and they won't take what you're saying into account or seriously. What's wrong with always communicating, you know, truths to people in the environment? There's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with exposing corruption. That's right. You should do that. Especially before the soon coming next generation that will lead the country. 17, 18, 19-year-olds. They're exactly who you need to be communicating to. And I asked the young ladies, I said, can anybody command your ignorance in Ireland? Command you not to know something? And the ladies said no. Can the courts command you not to know something? No. And then I proceeded to explain to them how presumption of constitutionality and the commanding of the presumption of constitutionality of legislation is commanding a form of ignorance. When our officials are paid to ascertain, you know, what is and what isn't constitutional and remove ambiguity and install clarity in those areas. And they were in agreement. And I think that riled the spirits. Because the spirits don't want you to think you're making any progress. Because again, it's a psychological, spiritual warfare. They don't want you to think you're breaking through at all. Because that'll only motivate you to keep going, you see. So this is how they try to keep the preacher of God down. And, you know, God will reprimand them if they get too physical or too violent, and that's not in God's will. He will put a stop to it. So, but to me that's a motivation that spurs me on, because if they're lashing out, they're panicking, and I should proceed. You know, cautiously and carefully and lovingly, but I should proceed. So I hope this has informed you well. I hope this has been informative to you. Michael D. Higgins is custodian of the Constitution. That means reasonably and logically. that he must check constitutionality of bills prior to their enactment into the law. Wouldn't be reasonable to do anything else. Wait a minute, you have to uphold and maintain the Constitution and the law, but you're signing stuff into law that you don't know is constitutional or not? And then you're commanding the Irish people to presume on its constitutionality? You're not doing your job. You're compromising national security. That is sedition and treason. Very, very big crimes in this land. We're talking the minimum prison sentence for treason in Ireland under the Treason Act Section 1 is 40 years in prison. To somebody like Michael D. Higgins, that's the rest of their life. It's a life sentence. Like, this is not stuff they should be playing around with. Now you see why they're ramming me. Like, they just shouldn't be messing with this kind of stuff. They would kill me if they could get away with it. But I'm too well known publicly. They couldn't hide it. Because I've been public speaking for quite a while. 6 years maybe in Wexford and all around the country wherever I could access. Preaching the gospel mainly, but also exposing corruption. And that's the bit they don't like. Like, I would speak out about COVID, say it's poison, don't inject it into your children. They didn't like that. About the vaccine. And now we have signs and we have retrospective we know that babies have been killed by those vaccines, and young and old people also. People dropping dead of heart attacks and all sorts of breakouts on their skin and all sorts of stuff, negative stuff as a result of the vaccines. We've all that data now. People aren't even bothering to try and hide it now because they've done the damage. They don't care. They just run away from the mess they make. They don't care. But they'll be held accountable by God. They don't care that they'll be held accountable by God. They're focusing on the here and the now and the flesh and the pleasures and fattening their belly and serving the devil, and they don't care about the ramifications. They don't even focus on them or think about them. They just live for the now. And that's why they do such evil. So, I'm not a fearful person. I will never back down from them. I will risk life and limb for this job that I do for Jesus Christ, my love, and my Lord and my God, my Creator. And I will serve him unto death if needs be. But I will not back down from this. In fact, I'm going to go back out and do it now in a few minutes. So blessings in Jesus' name. Holy kids. Love you. Blessings. Amen.